Hey, Jeannie,
Yeah, Bruce.
who's our guest on the Nerd Show?
Today we have Ruby Wincele. Welcome, Ruby.
Hi, Ruby.
Hi, thanks for having me on.
What are we going to talk about today?
Today we're going to talk about the benefits of infrastructure investments and green investments in Massachusetts.
What kind of investments are we talking about, and what are the benefits?
Yeah, that's a good question. The report that I'll be talking about is from Climate Exchange. It's called Investing in a Better Massachusetts, an analysis of job creation and community benefits. And we looked at a bunch of different infrastructure investments, climate investments, 29 individual projects that we combine into 18 programs. And those programs cover everything from transportation and housing, clean energy, grid modernization, natural resources, agriculture. So it's a lot. We wanted it to be as comprehensive as possible because the state has a lot of catching up to do in terms of their infrastructure investments. I think the most recent analysis, Massachusetts got a C- in infrastructure. Some of those essential aspects that we'll need to solve the climate crisis, like public transportation, kind of got the worst scores of all. So we kind of combined these 18 programs into three main categories, which are clean transportation, energy efficiency and renewables, and then natural resources and conservation. And we collectively call that the green investment portfolio, which is some of the findings I'll share today. We designed that to kind of reflect the investments that the state will need to make to meet the new 2030 emission reduction target, which is a 50% reduction by 2030 below 1990 levels.
So we're talking about investments over the next 10 years in Massachusetts. Is there like a total dollar value of the whole green investment portfolio?
We looked at everything on a $1 million scale. So we didn't look at kind of the total investment. I believe Synapse actually did a study in Massachusetts and found that just to get infrastructure to a state of good repair, it was about $117 billion to make up that gap in infrastructure investments by 2030. But to meet the state's climate goals, it's going to be probably even beyond that. We looked at everything on $1 million scale, so it's kind of easy to scale up or down for a program or an investment area or the whole portfolio to see if I have $5 million, what will it get me versus $30 million or something. So it's just easy to scale up. We wanted it to be kind of as useful for researchers and policymakers and advocates in the state. That's kind of part of Climate Exchange's mission. We want the data to be as accessible and as useful as possible. We found that every $1 million invested in the green investment portfolio supports 14 jobs. And you might be saying, okay, 14 jobs, what does that actually look like? So we measured two types of impacts. The first is the initial capital investment. So you're investing in the offshore wind project or the light rail expansion, stuff like that. And those create 9.3 jobs per $1 million. And then we also measured a second impact, which is the long-term energy savings from these investments. So when people don't have to spend as much on their utilities or on gas for their cars, what does it look like when they spend that money elsewhere in the state? And that's actually like a really significant portion of the job creation. It's about 4.7 jobs per $1 million as well. So it's pretty interesting to see the impacts of when people save money on utilities because they're just using less energy or switching to renewable energy, which is less expensive. That's contributing to significant job creation as well. And we also kind of wanted to put those into perspective. So we looked at the average job creation in Massachusetts overall. And then on that same $1 million scale, if you just spend $1 million in Massachusetts economy generally, you would create 8.5 jobs. And then as kind of a more targeted benchmark, we looked at like the 10 largest industries in Massachusetts, which includes stuff like research and development, hospitals, real estate, finance, those types of industries in the state. And you only support 7.8 jobs per $1 million. So when you invest in climate infrastructure and clean energy jobs and everything that we'll need over the next few decades, you're creating more jobs, you're creating better jobs with higher job quality and benefits.
Well, that sounds like really great news, actually. And I'm curious, like, what are you doing with the report? Like, how is that information getting out there and into the hands of people who can use it?
Yeah, so there are a couple ways. Massachusetts is one of those states where we do have staff dedicated to passing climate policy in the state. Climate Exchange focuses on state level policy, but we're involved across all 50 states. So this report is kind of really special to us because we actually now have people on the ground who can meet with legislators and executive agency officials. So we found that state legislators are really interested in this work. There are a few bills this legislative session that focus on raising revenue from carbon pollution, putting a price on carbon, or just simply making the investments that we need to meet the 2030 emission reduction target. So we've had meetings with a few legislators and also can use this research in a bunch of different ways. So beyond just looking at the investments, we've also been able to analyze actual bills that have been introduced this legislative session in Massachusetts and see if they have anything to do with spending and kind of on the programs that we focus on, where we can see the benefits of those bills and what those would bring to the state. We have this whole kind of benefit framework that we talk about, and there's a graphic showing 6 other types of benefits that we look at in the study, and those include stuff like energy cost savings, which I've talked a bit about, congestion time savings. So we can actually measure when you switch from driving your personal vehicle to public transportation, how does that reduce traffic congestion? And then what's the kind of economic value of that? So we can actually put a dollar amount on congestion reduction. And then we look at 3 types of public health benefits. The first one is, I think, really important, which is the air quality health benefits. So benefits from reducing air pollution, and then also physical activity health benefits, which I think is really interesting. So when you switch from driving your car to using public transportation, you just naturally have to walk or bike a bit more. And that's really beneficial to public health. So measuring the health benefits from just getting more exercise from these investments, as well as traffic accidents avoided. Driving your car is more dangerous than public transportation. And then the last one, which is an additional benefit, we like to talk about these investments in a way that centers people and their well-being. That's where all the job creation and health benefits and everything like that comes in. So looking at all those benefits, we find that the green investment portfolio creates around $2.2 million in total benefits for every $1 million invested. So it's actually more than paying back the upfront investment and actually more than double the upfront investment in terms of benefits.
You said earlier that Massachusetts is getting like a C+ for infrastructure, but meanwhile, like ACEEE keeps ranking us first or second on energy efficiency programs. I'm kind of wondering how to put those 2 things together. They seem contradictory.
Energy efficiency and retrofits and those types of investments are something that Massachusetts is really good at, and they've been spending millions and millions of dollars over the last probably decade and a half. I think one of the reasons they're making those investments is because our study shows that these are really good investments to make. So I talked about that 14 jobs per $1 million from the larger portfolio, but if we kind of focus on one energy efficiency and retrofitting program that we looked at, you actually create 28.8 jobs per $1 million. So it's more than double the portfolio, and it's almost 4 times as many jobs as kind of those benchmarks that we talked about. So it kind of makes sense that Massachusetts is investing in energy efficiency because it's so good for the economy. And then we also find that $1 million invested in this program creates around $4.2 million in benefits as well. Also around $500,000 in air pollution health benefits. And that's not even taking into account the damage of using natural gas for cooking. That's just from the air pollution that natural gas consumption causes. This is a great table because it kind of nicely summarizes a 6-month research effort on our part. And it looks at those 3 investment areas I talked about. It highlights those jobs per $1 million, the energy savings, the health and climate benefits that we talked about, but it also incorporates two other additional considerations, and that's investment scale and deployment speed. And we like to highlight these because they show first the amount of money that you need to spend in all these areas. So transportation, it just takes a lot of money to build out rail systems or to change the built environment so it's more friendly for people who are walking and biking. Renewables and energy efficiency is kind of in the middle of that. Like we talked about, Massachusetts has made a lot of investments in energy efficiency, but they still have a lot of catching up to do for renewables and grid modernization. And then conservation and natural resources is just not as expensive to make those investments. So they're kind of on a lower investment scale. And then deployment speed shows how long it'll take to plan and fund and complete these projects. And this is really important because as we're talking about potentially a federal infrastructure bill or, like the American Rescue Plan, the Massachusetts legislators are still figuring out how to spend that money, but that funding has a time limit. So we like to show this because it kind of highlights the fact that legislators and state decision makers need to be talking about these investments and planning them now, even ahead of money coming in, because once the money's there, then you need to spend it quickly. And the timeline for that doesn't always align with these timelines. So like transportation is kind of mixed because it's really easy to give an electric vehicle rebate and kind of get a new EV on the road, but it takes potentially years to even just plan a project like the East-West Rail, which is going to be connecting Western Massachusetts all the way to Boston. And then renewables and conservation, those are definitely quicker to plan, but they still need that planning ahead of the money coming in.
One thing we're seeing with buildings is questions around just, are there enough, like your analysis talks about the benefits as jobs as benefits, but then if you kind of flip it around in terms of the ramping and think about, well, this could be used for planning what kind of jobs we're going to need, what kind of skills and people, and, do we have enough HVAC contractors to do this work over this time period and things like that. So there's a kind of a pipeline and training aspect to it too, I would think.
Yeah, that's another really important point. We're able to model kind of and predict what types of jobs and occupation these investments will make. But there's a really critical component to that, which is workforce development and training and education, which is something that the state legislature and state policymakers need to consider. Make sure that it's equitable, make sure that there's diverse hiring and that people of color and women are actually represented in these jobs, because in Massachusetts and nationally, they're pretty underrepresented.
Where can people find the report that we've been talking about?
Yeah, they can find it on Climate Exchange's website. It's called Investing in a Better Massachusetts, an analysis of job creation and community benefits.
Thanks. And thanks for being on the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me.